I am excited to be here along with my colleague, Kellie. Very exciting topic for us. You'll probably hear the passion come out in our voice quite often. So we love to, have collaboration, and if you have any questions, feel free. It's nice to kind of a small group this morning. So feel free to, either insert in the chat box at the end. Of course, we have an area for, or time, I should say, for questions, comments, anything to share. So we love to, engage in that conversation. So don't feel like you can't stop us if something stands out to you. We love to kind of learn from each other. And with this pandemic, everything is so new. We're seeing all different things. So if you have any ideas, suggestions, love to hear from you. So topic for today is military culture amongst the pandemic. I know that's kind of the highlight of this conference if you're looking at all of the different titles. But our presentation is going to specifically focus on the military culture in general and some of the variances that they experienced during this time frame and still are experiencing. And you'll see some of the statistics and different things that relate differently to this population. My name is Nicole Arcuri Sanders. I'm currently core faculty over at Capella University. And long story short, I guess I have started with this population through being sent to them by other positions, whether it's in a school, private practice, in a hospital setting, inpatient, outpatient, and the military culture kind of kept popping up as an area in need that was not being addressed. So that was kind of where my passion started. I always joke that I swore that after working with them from the counseling context, that I would never marry, in the military. I had my parameters. Well, I am now a military spouse. I now have a military child. So it's, never say never. So it's been interesting to see what my previous research and work clinically has kind of transformed to now knowing from both sides a bit. So you'll also hear from me and Kellie kind of sharing some insight from our experiences in both these approaches. I do clinically still support the military population through the American Red Cross, as well as through MFLAC work, which is Military Family Life Counselors, which used to be called contract work, but nowadays all the terminology has shifted, but pretty much you could use short-term, long-term, all different stints that you're embedded with a unit. So we'll also be sharing some insights to how our work has been in this time frame as well. And then here's Kellie.
Hi, I'm Kellie. I have a very similar story to Nicole, and that's probably why we work so well together. My full-time job is I'm an assistant research professor for the Clearinghouse for Military Family Readiness at Penn State. And what we do is we work on Department of Defense grants. So we are often doing different program evaluation and implementation for the military. So for example, I've worked on a lot of suicide prevention and intervention projects. And I'm now working with the Family Advocacy Program, which works very closely. We're working with the providers, but the providers, of course, are working very closely with clients, so service members or families, if they're involved in issues such as domestic violence, child abuse, and we're working on a new staffing model for that program. I found passion for this, in a roundabout way. I was working in corrections and there were so many incarcerated veterans, and I had to ask myself, what systems failed them? Like knowing that this is a group that had so many supports out there, supposedly, in terms of the VA, funds available, how did they end up now incarcerated? And so that did really spark my interest more at the clinician and the research level. I was a military spouse. I was also a military significant other. So I've definitely seen both perspectives as well. What it's like to be directly in the culture, and then what it's like to be connected via research and your professional workspace. So wherever you're coming from, we welcome you, and we'd love to hear your perspective too on how you're connected and what you are even experiencing if you're part of this culture during the pandemic.
Thank you, Kellie. All right. So what we're hoping to accomplish today, we're going to spend a little bit of time describing the uniqueness of the military culture. I mean, we can spend hours, days, months getting into the nitty gritty of that. Same thing with any other culture. But we're going to give you a snapshot and then also give you some resources if you're looking to kind of find out more, dig a little bit deeper into that. The next one we're going to be, or next thing we're going to try to do is look at the unique needs of the military population in relation to the pandemic. As you'll hear from us, there's been a lot of variances in regards to limitations that they face, specifically whether they were on an installation, if they were out in the civilian world. So kind of focus on what were their unique needs, what were their barriers, and how do we work with those aspects. Then we're going to be looking at evidence-based practices to be implemented with the military connected population during this time, considering the pandemic. And before I kind of shift over and hand over to Kellie, I just wanted to highlight something she said in regards to significant other. And I know we keep using the word military connected. So military connected is very broad. So, right, you can be a spouse, you can be a child, you could be a stepchild, you could be a mom, a dad, an aunt, an uncle, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a friend. It looks very different. A lot of agencies don't support from the Department of Defense area servicing many of those connected. So for instance, if you are a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a significant other, but you are not married and considered, I like to do quotes for dependent because many of us joke that we don't depend on you. But the fact that you are not considered the service members dependent in the military system, you do not have access to base unless they bring you on. You don't have access to services. Many things are kind of closed off. So like if, for instance, you are not married and you're not listed on their emergency information and your significant other who's in the service is deployed, you will not be privy to all that information in regards to when they return. So, there's a lot of different things when you think about military connected. There is one area, or I should say organization, Given Hour. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of that, but they focus on providing services to all military connected. So it's a free program out there. So if you are a girlfriend, boyfriend, friend, mother, father, grandma, whatever it may be in that relation, aunt, uncle, because everyone's family looks different, right? So an aunt might raise the service member, or a grandmother might raise the service member, that you are able to get services to support you with the idea of being part of that military culture and the lifestyle experiences that you were having with that service member. Oh, that's awesome, Brooke. I just saw that Kellie saw that too. Yeah, it is a great resource. So if anyone ever has time, I like to kind of give that little plug. You can give pro bono services to service members and their military connected in need. Well, okay, I'm sorry, Kellie. I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, that was perfect. And of those who are attending today, just with the reactions, or you could use a chat or you could chime in, how many would say that they are military connected? And that helps us really derive our conversation on culture. If you are all attached, it doesn't seem like we need to spend a lot of time on this area, but I'm seeing one hand raised.
Yeah.
Brooke, I see fellow military spouse. And not sure about the rest, but exciting. So please, please, please feel free to chime in if you want to share your perspective throughout the presentation. But what we are focusing on this slide is we want to focus on how counselors, so if we're thinking of our role as counselors, we will encounter a variety of different cultures. And so the military is a unique culture. So Nicole and I, in some of our work in research, we have tried to publish on this topic time and time again. And we've noticed that it can be really frustrating in that journals and reviewers don't often associate the military as its own culture. And so I'll never forget, I always use this as an example. One of the feedback that we received from reviewers was, I'm not understanding how this is a culture. How is this different than, say, a truck driver? And I was like, okay, I guess I'm sort of understanding that. First of all, you let the frustration settle in because you have this whole section on military culture. It's talking about, and we'll get to the next, when we get to the next slide, you'll see it is talking about the military mission, chain of command, military language, all of these things that encompass culture. And yet they're questioning us and saying, well, there's other positions out there in the civilian world that parents are away for extended periods of time, and so on and so forth. So really, to emphasize here, we know that there are a variety of cultures that as counselors we need to be prepared to work with, because when we're looking at the counseling relationship, there's so many key components such as values, beliefs, traditions, language, all of these things that may show differences in communication style. So if we're not understanding that initial culture, it's going to be really difficult and even detrimental to the client that we're working with. So what is military culture? And again, feel free to chime in if there's something that resonates with you based on how you're connected. But we know that there's this chain of command. Orders are passed down through this hierarchy. So we've got the higher ranked, and it moves down to the lower ranked until everyone who needs to be tasked is tasked to implement that order. There's the military language. So you can see here on the slide, they've got, well, I guess they've got their own alphabet. That's a little bit different. So they use the phonetic alphabet, which consists of those 26 code words. If you've ever called into the insurance companies, they usually have you spell your name and they use this alphabet. At first, I was always like, okay, my last name, Z as in zebra, and they'd repeat back to me. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that's right. And I never knew what was going on, but then I fully understood, okay, this is the alphabet that they're using. And for the military, it's so important so that they can ensure that critical combinations are transmitted and received appropriately through voice messages. But going back to that military language, there's acronyms, there's that alphabet, there's slang. Some of this is branch specific. So while we're talking about military culture kind of as a whole, each branch has its own subcultures. So when we're looking at further making this more difficult, language may be different. Service members usually encompass everyone, but then when you go down to the branch level, we've got our sailors, we've got our Marines. And so it's really important for us to be able to some extent understand what they're saying, because it can be very frustrating in the counseling relationship for the client to continuously say, I'm not or you're not understanding me, or the counselor constantly asking, what does that mean? I don't know what you're referring to. Some we're more familiar with in terms of acronyms because of media exposure. So AWOL, absent without leave, that's something that seems to be repeating, in the news and movies, things like that. But all of this is important because it does help you to connect. It helps you to understand the experience of the military service member, and that in addition to what their military mission was. So that's going to vary based on who you've got in front of you. And even if you're meeting, let's say, with two people who work together, whatever that mission is, that experience is going to be very different. So someone could have talked about a deployment experience in a very negative way. Someone could have gone through that same military deployment experience and had a very positive outcome. And so as counselors, these are all things that we need to consider when we are working with this group. And then just finally, military laws. So we are bound by laws. We've got our state, federal, etc. We know that we can't speed because there's a law that says that. The military has very specific, their own unique laws as well. So that's something to consider as well. if a service member comes, I know that there's a lot of examples where service members come to counseling because they're struggling with getting in trouble, or there's an issue within their family, and the military is handling that issue in a very different way than what would have been the outcome in civilian life. Anything to add or any questions about military culture? Anyone on here that maybe is a little bit less familiar? Take that as a good thing to move on. So why are we spending so much time on military culture? Well, because when we look at the military and we look at mental health, there is still this stigma that exists. And when we look at stigma, that really means that there's barriers to the client with regards to mental health care. So military training, it teaches service members to be stoic. What that means is they often internalize their feelings. They learn that they must weather any difficulties that they're having. And this is all done in order to remain combat ready. In the literature, there's a lot of research to support that service members are often reluctant to seek out mental health because of this. So they not only are less likely to seek out mental health services, when they do, they underreport their symptoms, or they often end treatment prematurely. So that's why it's so important for us to emphasize that counseling and that therapeutic relationship. What can we do to help prevent some of these things? How can we create this safe space? In addition, there's this perception that if they receive help, again, because of their training, that there's weakness. There's this sign of weakness that they're showing. In addition, they may face negative repercussions. Again, we're talking about those military laws. We're talking about chain of command. All of these things could end up in negative repercussions such as job loss or loss of security clearances, loss of a promotion, and even medical discharge. So what that means is that this individual could be rendered unfit for duty. And what that would mean for the service member and their family is that they would, their experience or their life as a military member would change forever. Just to add to that, I guess an example that I have, I always think of a pilot that I've talked to, she was experiencing a lot of anxiety. And so she said, I'd love to receive mental health treatment, but here's the thing, if they deem that my anxiety is severe enough, what else am I going to do? I'm very like this, I'm trained to be a pilot, and that is what I do for the military. So there didn't seem to be many options of how she could change her role to work more on the ground, so to speak. So there was that fear of, should I get help because I am experiencing anxiety? It's leading to things like inability to sleep. So you can see how some of those symptoms and trends would be more higher risk if they're in that role and they are flying other people. So that's just an example of when we're thinking of mental health, the military, and stigma, for a service member, there's a lot that goes through their mind.
And I just wanted to add real fast to that is, as we know, 20 years anniversary from 9/11, right? It's kind of quickly approaching. With that being said, in the recent years, there is a kind of surge of those who signed up because of 9/11 specifically, or encouraged them to enlist at that point, or or go into OCS through the officer side of it. They are coming out at this point, many of them retiring. In the last couple years, what has happened is a lot of them have seen combat, multiple deployments with combat. And towards the end of their careers, there has been kind of this increase where they have not wanted to seek services during that time because they're so close to retirement. So do they want to give that up? So that has been kind of another thing that is happening, or I'm seeing in the last couple of years. And this may look different for everybody. As you know, right, there's all different types of deployments. I often joke with my husband on one of his deployments that he was out there scuba diving and having fun, and here I am, back at home keeping everything straight. But then there's other deployments where, I know every day he's feared, and every day we feared for him. So it is, very different. And when Kellie had mentioned the idea of being compared to a truck driver, right? They're both away for long periods of time, but the spouse, the children, the military connected when they are in the military, and they know that their mom, dad, or whoever it is, significant other, is leaving them for a dangerous training or a dangerous combat deployment, or knowing that at any point when they're deployed that they may be called for something because they are stationed there for a reason. There's always this unknown fear of concern for their well-being in a different way, right? And I actually had a really intense dialogue with this with somebody one time, and they're like, well, truck drivers, driving, there's a lot of accidents on the road. And I said, I by no means am trying to say it's not, an unsafe profession in regards to there are risks out there, but there's a different culture in regards to knowing mom or dad may never come back because they have ultimately made the oath to make the ultimate sacrifice for our country, right? And to safeguard the well-being and the way America wants to live their lives, our livelihood. So just wanted to give some information there. We have tons more information here if you want more information on military culture. Seems like a lot of you guys, are embedded in it and you know it, but always feel free to reach out. If you have any resources that you would love to share, please do so. The last one, I just want to point out the warrior ethos that Kellie had spoke about earlier. That is something really interesting to think about in regards to that stigma piece Kellie brought up. So, right, just walking into the office is stigma in itself, because as Kellie stressed to you, that idea of being seen unfit for duty. So this is a great way with the pandemic for us as counselors to figure out how can we get more creative. I used to do a lot of environmental, so nature-based approaches, where I would use horticulture with families. There's a lot of horseback riding, equestrian assisted therapies out there right now with veterans. With active duty, it seems to be more limited, right? Because we have to also have that idea of how does it connect. They are to see their own active duty providers or who are assigned to them on base. So, right, we have those barriers, but we are seeing that many are coming outside and paying out of pocket and are not using insurance because they do not want it connected. So there is also this idea of adrenaline junkies, they like to refer to it. So they seeking adventure-based or group counseling that is not focused so much on the mental health, but is giving them this environment where they feel safe to have these conversations, whether it's with others where they have camaraderie or if it's individual. I remember also doing lots of hikes. We just literally go for a walk because it was less threatening to go for a walk with me than to come into my office and sit down and have a session where everyone knew that was the counseling session. So just, ideas and things to think about as we move forward and as you guys are thinking about things or adding things. So military culture with the pandemic, I'm currently in North Carolina, so I had left this slide here. Every state is a little bit different. But the reason that I left it here is because North Carolina is huge in regards to being military interconnected. In fact, military and defense industries, it's the second largest employers in the state. It's one of the largest military footprints, according to basically the whole country, because of the number of installations that we have in the state. So military families, this is something wherever you are, they live on installations, on base, but also in communities, right, in the civilian world. So it's really something important to know about. I always say that Fort Bragg, that's awesome. That's not too far for me, about 2.5 hours. So there's so many things to consider when you think about that idea of being in the civilian sector of it, because they are part of our communities. I know my family, we go to the local tree lighting We do local things here. We go to local restaurants. We don't stay on base. We are embedded in the community. My son does not go to the Child Development Center on base. We are out in town. The biggest thing I want to stress here too is when you also have families who are not active duty, they often go underserved because they might be reservists and they might be National Guard. And so they are living kind of this half life. They are civilian for most of the time, but then they also have this time frame where, you know, dad, mom, whoever the service member is uprooted. And what happens is the other community that they're surrounded by often is not prepared to handle the needs of that family because they're not around a military installation. So with our National Guard or with reservists who get even called to active duty, that is often times where the family is left there and trying to live this civilian life, but then the service member is gone. So you have to be prepared for that wherever you are, because there are living amongst us and they do need those services. So just like ACA and any other culture, just being prepared to address their needs. And as we all know, we don't have to be experts in all, but we just need to know where to turn in order to best serve our clients. So pandemic restrictions with COVID-19, the installations itself operated under different restrictions. So for instance, they had no movement orders. They had situations where if you had to get testing and you were active duty for COVID-19, you can only go to a certain building. If you were a family member, you can only go to a certain building. You know, going out in town, where is your state of residence, right? That's another big thing for military because we all move all over the place. So when they're trying to do tracking of things, right, you're all connected to your state of residence, but you're living in North Carolina, but my state of residence might say Pennsylvania. So it's all different. So lots of different things to consider with that. And that is something you need to have an open conversation with your clients because of the fact that also different installations operated different ways. And when they ended up taking off, saying basically like the East Coast installations, this is your guidance, coming all the way down. And then they said, okay, now we're going to allow each installation to use their command to enforce their restrictions based on the current needs of that installation and what is happening in the community surrounding them. So that changed again, right? So now that may also change for those that are traveling for work purposes between installations because they have to follow certain protocol. We all recently went out to Camp Pendleton in California and we stayed on base there. And it was really interesting because their restrictions were way different. But if we left base and we went out into town into San Diego, they just opened up literally 2 weeks ago. So it was very different compared to what is happening here in North Carolina, where our population is very much smaller and not impacted as much in the way that they were having their situations in relation to even still to this day, lack of ICUs available. So when thinking about the military, we talk a lot about the service member, we talk a lot about the culture, what that looks like for the service member, but support systems you have to remember for the service member and those connected to them is very different because of the fact that they are not often living with family and friends that they've grown up with. They are usually uprooted. They usually move every 2 to 4 years. So when they have roots and they start to kind of get settled, it's usually time to move. So when it's time to move, then you have to start all over. So during a time right now with the pandemic, this was even more of a struggle. Many families actually had their stuff in transit to be moving to a different installation. Service member was ready to check in. They signed out of one installation and then they were told, hey, there's a no movement order. No one is to go anywhere. And now their stuff was gone, their house was sold or rented out, and they were living in base housing in apartments, or they were living at hotels. They were living with other people and quarantining with friends they had here until they can move again. That also stopped on the other side. Stuff was gone. So there was this increased urgency now. How do, they have no beds that's in the moving truck. They have nowhere to go with these moving trucks. And that happened for a lot of people. They had to get special permission, but now you also had to check in with, like I said, that other installation. What is your protocol? Once they got somewhere, how many days are we quarantining? This also impacted deployments. So after a deployment would come home, let's say during the pandemic, they had to do a quarantine time. So now you knew mom, dad, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, whatever it was, significant other is back stateside or back near you, and you could still not see them because before they can see you, they had a quarantine after this. Many also had their deployments extended. I know specifically of a friend, and gosh, she had all the kiddos ready to go meet dad. And literally, as you know, they're talking about, we're going to see dad, tomorrow morning. We have one more wake up. And then they found out because of the pandemic that they would not be seeing dad. So this is, something that does not necessarily always happen in the civilian sector. And a lot with medical right now with the pandemic. So that's something as a comparison, first responders. But just wanted to highlight some of those variances. I share some pictures here for you because I keep saying military is embedded. So, right, I have a Christmas tree. I'm sitting in my living room. I'm watching my child on a baby monitor. Civilians, military, we all do the same things, right? But in my house, I'm in a community going to a farm for a fall festival, doing the same things as civilians. And many people sometimes do not know that I live a very different life, and vice versa. So that is just something to consider when you're working with service members and their families and those that are connected. I just wanted to point out to you, I know I had mentioned North Carolina has a lot of installations, but this is just some of the, varied ones here to kind of show you the high precedence here. I know Texas is another big one. Florida is another big one. So just kind of important to know where you live with that. So I mentioned this before, and I'm trying to be cognizant of time so we can get to that exciting part of the actual, intervention piece. The DoD Stop Movement Order, right? So PCS, many of you seem to know the lingo here. So permanent change of station, so moving. That was stopped, as I had shared. Travel, business and non-related business was stopped. Training, so schoolhouses, for instance, boot camp at one point was stopped. When we were out in Camp Pendleton, they just had a huge increase. They just opened up boot camp again a couple months ago. And I guess with all the new influxes, right, they had small groups come in, they started to increase it. Well, I have never gone through so much of reporting who I was and where I was. And when I went into the commissary, I had to write my name, I had to write my phone number, I had to write what time I came there and what dependents I had with me. You had to sanitize before you touched the door. You had to sanitize once you walked in. I felt like I was in this kind of I almost felt like I was in a hospital setting trying to go to the commissary at the exchange. It was really, really interesting to watch because that is not what's happening at my installation at all. But they had said that they even had to quarantine the schoolhouses. So there's a recruit school there and or recruit training. So those that are sent out as recruiters is there. There's also a drill sergeant centered, or I'm sorry, a drill instructor training on that base as well. And they had to separate them as well from the boot campers because of the fact that they said the boot campers coming in all being in such close space, COVID was rampant. So they were trying to keep everything else. There was not one coffee shop open. I was dying for some coffee and it was not going to happen for me. So that is something to consider, that it is very specific to where you are, who is there. They also stopped in for that specific base when they had movements where somebody was going, for example, drill instructor school, where they had families moving with them. They went for a training and then they would live there and actually be the drill instructor. They would not allow the dependents to move with them until the numbers went down. So think about that in regards to separation during this time that is so stressful with the pandemic and quarantining and all the different things happening. The travel restrictions that many find interesting, and I remember even my family almost kind of gawking at me, like, what do you mean you can't go? I know Greg can't go, but what do you mean you can't go? And it was because of the fact that the Department of Defense said even the dependents, and then when it first happened in March, it was extended to June 30th. So that meant if you had, trips home, I know a couple of my neighbors, they had first birthday parties of their children. They had christenings, kind of all partnered together to try to do it so the family can all be together. So they mushed all these different exciting events together for them, and then they still couldn't do it because of the fact that the no movement order was there. So once again, something to consider, and these restrictions have changed based on where the installation was. Here's just some examples of it and resource to tell you a little bit about what is still happening out there. As of January 4th, there was still 89 out of the 231 installations that had restrictions. I did look the other day, and it actually is around the same number because of those fluctuations. I think it was 87 3 days ago, but it did drop for a little bit, but then it went back up again. So that is something to consider. What is happening out in town where you are, or county level, is not always what is happening on an installation. So those that are also living out in town have to kind of live by two different ways. So just something to consider when working with those service members. Another area I wanted to just point out is the statistics that you may see on TV. I know for me, my channel 1 every morning, they report what the statistics are for my county. Something to consider is that the military is not always included in them. So what I'm finding with CDC is your driver's license or your state of residence is where your number of positive gets counted to. So even though I might be living in North Carolina, but let's say I'm a resident of Pennsylvania, because right with military, our residency changes. So I would have my positive, if I was positive, counted towards Pennsylvania. If I was negative, Pennsylvania would get that. Now, this is not always the same though with our service members, because active duty, they have different areas where their numbers are specifically being held by the DoD. So even though, for instance, my husband, right, he lives in this county, we are in North Carolina, but if he tested positive, the DoD would have his number, and it's not reported out in town, does not get reported back to his state of residence. So lots of considerations to think about. I always tell my husband, okay, they say the numbers are going down, but it's not accounting for what's going on base. And you guys, are everywhere. So it's very interesting because it has you kind of think in a different mindset, because you're thinking about two different statistics and you're trying to have to do that assessment yourself. I know those some spouses that had tested positive that lived on base, they quarantined on base. Well, there was a lot of different protocol when a spouse had tested positive out in the town, because then, right, that significant other, the service member, they had different protocols with their unit because of the fact that now they were outside of town and not living on base. So it's very interesting. So, and some units have different protocols than others based on the training needed at that time, based on the requirements of the job, right, their occupation. So I know when my husband went out and they had field training, gosh, so many of them came back positive. But it came back to a point where they had to do it because they had a deployment coming up. So even though there was a non-movement order for so long, that certain units got special permission because they did have to transition some of those deployments and get some of the people home and get others out. So, they had this kind of special order for them. Well, then it ended up an increase in cases, and it was kind of this roller coaster that kept going. So something to consider in a pandemic that many don't know. So supports. I'm going to turn this over to Kellie for a little bit, and then I promise you guys we'll jump into how do we work with them.
Yes, I'll be short and sweet with this, but it's interesting because a lot of the counselors that I've talked to that work with the military, they've always expressed this almost like limited service. They have long wait lists. It's hard to get people in. It's hard to get people in terms of those wait lists, but then also that prevention piece, like how can we identify individuals who are struggling, bring them into these support services and help them before things get really bad. With the pandemic, it's been even more interesting to see because they're unable to refer out. So even if they've had providers in the field, I say, or outpatient, that when their wait lists get really bad, they can say, okay, we've got like this partnership, this agreement that we can send people out into the community for service when we're overwhelmed. There was nothing when we're talking about those like stop movement orders. It's kind of similar in mental health. So they were trying to treat everyone in-house so that there wasn't a lot of movement. They could keep track of everyone and how they were doing. But again, they struggled because they are only so many providers. So how are we able to, we've identified that X number of people are pretty high risk right now because of all the things going on in the family, but we don't have the support or the ability to fit them in our schedule. And when we're looking at our schedule, we've had to make this really quick, drastic shift of in-person to telemental health. And so across the services, it was interesting to hear how providers and sites were not all equipped in the same way. So services were offered via telemental health, where some only had phones, others did have video ability. So for providers, you know, some of them noted concerns regarding, is it ethical to do assessments via phone only? Like, I can't see my client. How can I really assess this child, this family, the safe space? We used to go in the homes, for example. So it's been a lot of barriers, not only to bring in clientele, but then also to service them. And so when we think of our military providers out in the fields who, you know, there's a lot of providers who have reduced their caseload because they're overwhelmed themselves. So they've got stuff going on in their family with regards to health, well-being, childcare issues. And so they may not even be taking as many people. So it's kind of this, when we're looking at supports have changed so much given all of the restrictions that are in place. And when you're thinking of where do the military have access, that's changed a lot. And you're taking away, in some sense, a lot of those DoD resources that they were funneled into.
And just to kind of expand on this, we keep saying, you know, supports look different. You know, Kellie stressed here those long waiting lists. Just to give you an example, on the very bottom it says consider medical emergencies, births of children. I had a child during the pandemic, first child, right? So everything's abnormal. I don't know what's going on. Well, I had some difficulties and I needed physical therapy. So I only got approved to see a provider 9 months later. So that's huge, you know, and it's because of these limitations. And this is what people in the civilian world are facing too, due to these limits. We are getting ready to PCS, and due to the decrease in numbers because of COVID, the Child Development Center, you know, they lowered their numbers that they can allow. I'm on a 2-year wait list to get my child in to daycare. So, you know, 2-year wait list, we might be moving by that time. But so this is an interesting concept when you're looking at military in general, because their supports look so different. So sometimes when you're living among friends, family, and you're embedded in a community for a long period of time, you know people to call, you know, kind of, we always say, if you know who, you know, to call for help, you kind of work your way in faster. But a lot of times military do not know because they're always new. So you can't always pick up a phone and say, hey, do you mind watching so-and-so? You know, I have to go to work, or this emergency came up, because everything's new. So just also consider that. So when you're doing those biopsychosocials, those intakes, getting these details about their supports and lack of supports is huge. And it may change. So that's something you may need to revisit with the military. So that kind of leads us really into this idea of getting realistic. To work with the military, right? There's tons of evidence-based approaches to work with tons of diagnoses. However, an amazing approach in working with the military is utilizing reality therapy. The reason for that is because it allows the service member, the dependent, the military connected, the spouse, the child, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, whoever is connected into the military culture, to truly do an honest assessment of what does my life look like in regards to this situation, being in the role I am connected to the military. So this also allows for the counselors to get a realistic impression of, what is the culture from their perspective, right? Varies per branch. Kellie kind of went into all that earlier, right? The subculture of it, supports, lack of support, resources, barriers, really get an in-depth picture. It also offers clients to offer an opportunity for them to form a relationship with a counselor, right? That is based on understanding, it's non-judgmental. Here we are having an opportunity on this even-based platform to truly understand, what does your world look like? What do you really want to come out of this work as together with counseling? And what realistically can it look like? Because sometimes, right, if we were asked the miracle question and solution focus, we might have this amazing miracle that we, ideal image that we want. But in the reality of the military culture with their constraints and what that looks like in regards to their family or their unit, that may not be possible. So for instance, you may have spouses that are of the service member that, are having difficulty with relationships and job finding and employment. And they might have this ideal image, but based on the reality of what their military lifestyle looks like, maybe they can't travel for work because they have children and their service member is gone often and they don't have any other support to provide childcare. So, right. So even though that's an ideology of what they want, you have to work with the reality of it of, okay, if you want this, what realistic expectations do you need to set in place, supports to meet that happening? Or do you need to change what that ideology looks like? So this can be very, very empowering for clients because of the fact that reality really focuses on the 5 basic needs. So loving, belonging, power and sense of worth, freedom or independence, fun, sense of pleasure, and survival. So there's this idea of, this is what I need to survive, but this is what I need to be happy. But I also want to feel empowered and I want to feel love, but I also want to feel that I can do this on my own. So all of these ideas are embodied with reality therapy. And once again, the thing I'm going to stress is it stresses in the treatment approach, what are aspects outside of their control? In the military, whether you are the service member or you're connected to them in some way, there are many things in your life that are outside your control. I can submit a wish list of places I would love to live. It is outside my control when I get the order that says, none of those places are going to happen. So, but you have to have that realistic expectation or time frames, right? We might say a service member is going to be coming home after a 6-month deployment, but that is what we are hoping. It is outside of our control and actually when they will be allowed to come back due to, their structure in regards to hierarchy and with COVID-19, those implications that kept changing. So reality therapy, they consider it the WDEP system, the WEP, wants doing evaluation and planning. Now, this is very familiar with the military culture because military culture is structured. This provides them with an opportunity to lay it out. This is what I want very clearly. This is what I'm doing to get that. Looking at both of them, are they realistic, right? So it really evaluates again, support systems, barriers, strengths. What does this really look like? So you're evaluating it. You're constantly going back, this changed now in my lifestyle. Maybe someone got a promotion or there's a deployment or somebody's coming home. There's a reunification period, right? You have to change roles again when everybody's in a household. So we need to evaluate that and you plan. Now, in the military, a lot of people say you usually plan, then you sit by and wait, right? Because things are always changing. So the reality therapy aspect of it really allows you to focus with your clients using the lifestyle approach they have because you get to reevaluate, you get to replan. It is okay to shift. And that is something that a lot of individuals have problems with, right? The idea of change. Military culture, it is all about change. A lot of things are out of the control, but how do you become okay with change? So can you bring in other aspects of interventions from different modalities? Absolutely. However, sticking with the overall arching umbrella of reality therapy is really important because it focuses again on, okay, this is in your control, this is out of your control, this is realistically what you have as a strength, realistically as a support, this is realistically a barrier. Okay, let's work on it now. So it always recenters them and it can change with the reality of their change. Just little things I wanted to point out. So when working with children, right, it also allows you to focus on the fact that children sacrifice a lot too, because they often give up their service member to protect others, right? They might not want mommy or daddy, to go, but they have to. So that is something that's in their reality. Somebody is usually gone for periods of time, whether it is to train or combat related or non-combat related. However, something that a lot of people forget is a lot of accidents or injuries to service members actually happen during training. So that is just as scary for some, the spouse, the children, and the service member. So there's this idea that there is a great deal of risk. Is someone going to come back safely? Is it going to be months? Is it going to be days? Sometimes you think it's days, then it's going to be weeks, then it's months. So having this unknown in the culture comes up. Now with the spouses, right, they have a lot of these situations that we just mentioned with children too, in regards to kind of the unknown and being aware of all this. But there's also a different stressor in relation to the marital. So, right, there's this stress because it's always changing in roles. They're joining, they're disjoining, they have to change their roles. They're either kind of running a single parent household, or maybe they have somebody else coming to stay with them to help for a bit. With COVID-19, maybe you expected somebody to come, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, friend, and they couldn't get there. So now what do you do? Right? So lots of different things to consider. Or you thought grandma was only coming for 2 weeks and now she has to quarantine with you for 3 months. Oh my goodness, right? Or maybe it was, your mother-in-law, who knows, right? So, but these things look different. So that's something to consider. Now, commonly seen mental health issues for the service member veterans, trauma, PTSD. Now, that is something that a lot of people overdiagnose with because they think, oh, it must be PTSD. Sometimes it's adjustment disorder, right? They just had a big shift and you need to work with them. Sexual assault is a major common issue. Suicide, addiction, things with transition are huge. Mood disorder is related to transitions as well as relationship concerns. So that's something to consider too. You really need to know in that biopsychosocial what is happening. Okay, what is happening in their life right now, and do I need to revisit it because those supports change? Another thing, though, that many people forget is that there are tons of resources out there to help you, whether you are a civilian counselor or you are contracted by the military to work with service members. You need to know them, though. So that is the thing where you need to do your homework. If you send somebody somewhere and say, hey, here's a resource, and it doesn't work, whether the client is military or not, they're going to feel very disappointed. So you also need to know, is that resource available for that branch of service? So there is a lot of resources out there, and there's a lot of issues with Coast Guard because they are Department of Defense, and they are Homeland Security, where the other branches are Department of Defense, so they do not qualify for all of the services that the other branches receive. So that's something to consider. But knowing where to go and remembering to stick with their reality. And I know I keep saying the word reality, but you can use all of those other interventions. But if you embed reality, you are meeting that client where they are in their frame of mind, in their mindset, in their lifestyle, and you are able to really assist them coming from a way of support, non-judgment, and having the ability to readdress things. I know we threw tons at you. We only have like a couple minutes. So I just want to stop here and kind of throw it out. If you guys have any comments, questions, concerns, anything that you would need from Kellie or myself.
Well, we are always here for you. We thank you for attending our presentation. And if there's something that comes up, please, please, please reach out. We would love to talk to you.
Sorry, I was muted. I just went back to the first slide, just so if you wanted to write down our email addresses or anything, just know we're always able and willing to connect. Love to hear from you. I know we're kind of a small, passionate group, but with our passion and with kind of group efforts, that's where change happens. So thank you so much again, guys, for being here with us today. Thank you, everyone.